Hi, and welcome back to Uproarious. I'm Rory, and today we're going to talk about the emotional category known as anger. Anger is a motivating stress response. Its primary function is to get us to do something about something that we think is being done incorrectly. The stress response starts in the amygdala. This is a small almond-shaped part of the brain that controls our stress responses, and its job is to identify potential threats and then look for more information to contextualize those threats by asking other parts of the brain, and preparing to handle those threats by sending messages to other organs, including our digestive system and our kidneys. Now, the signals that it sends to our digestive system are basically slow down. We don't want to waste a lot of energy on digestion when we need to be fighting or running away. Now, the kidneys have a different function. Instead of being suppressed the way that the digestive tract is, they get a spike of energy so that they can produce two specific stress hormones. One is known as adrenaline, or epinephrine, and the other is known as cortisol. Now, these stress chemicals have some jobs to do, and they do them very quickly without waiting for the brain to contextualize everything first. This is because these chemicals are part of our fight or flight response, and that needs to happen very rapidly before we actually understand what the threat is or is not. So we see a threat, our amygdala activates, it sends messages to the brain, it sends messages to the kidneys. We get a burst of energy, our blood starts to pump through us faster, and we get more oxygen to our extremities like our hands and feet. Now, up to now, all we're experiencing is a stress response. But once we start to get messages from the brain that contextualize the threat that we've perceived, this is where anger is born. Anger comes from our brain interpreting the perceived threat as being something that needs to be confronted, approached, attacked, or fought with in some way. This can be a physical altercation like a fist fight or using a weapon, but it can also be a motivation to have an argument or to protect somebody or defend somebody who can't defend themselves. In this way, when we look at the fight or flight response, also known as the stress response, what we see is that fight is defined by anger. When we are going to look at a stressful situation and say, I need to do something about this right now, this needs fixing, that's what anger is. Let's look at some of the words we use when we're talking about anger. There are a lot of words that people use to describe anger, and their experiences are a little bit different for each word, but most of them fall into similar categories, much like our other emotional categories have had so far. The first category for this is fairness. When we perceive that something isn't fair, either that we have gotten too much or too little, or that somebody else has gotten too much or too little, we may have angry emotional responses to that. And we might describe those as feeling wishful or envious. We might also feel displeasure or resentment, dissatisfaction. All of these kind of angry emotions indicate to us that something isn't fair or something isn't the way that it should be. We might also have emotions that can be kind of described as longing, having a greed or a craving for something that manifests in anger is a common way to experience anger when what we have doesn't feel like it's enough. Finally, we have kind of our grumpy emotions. So we have anger, wrath, fury, annoyance, hostility, and of course just being grumpy. There's no such thing as good or bad anger. Anger has uses all over the world, all throughout our lives, every day, any day of the year. And what we have to remember is that there are more and less effective times to act on our anger. Next, let's talk about the purpose of anger. Anger is an important part of our lives from the time we're very small until the day we die. It is one of the ways that our brain communicates with us that something needs to be protected or corrected. So, when we have a child who is threatened or a significant other who is threatened, we may go into a protective anger to protect them from harm. But if we see that something isn't being done fairly, we may use that anger to vote to change laws or to confront other people who are not doing things in a fair fashion. Anger doesn't always look like spitting and screaming at people. It can be a calm, peaceful experience where you are contemplating what needs to be fixed and how to fix it. That anger still exists and you have more energy than normal and your focus may be a little bit more drawn in, but you can still be calm while you're angry. Because of the complexity of anger, let's look at the ways that it communicates to us and to other people. When we are experiencing anger, our brain is telling us that something that we're doing or experiencing is important and needs tending to. But when we experience anger, it communicates to other people that we really care about the thing that we're interacting with, thinking about, or working on. In this way, anger is a communication tool that tells other people what's important to us, and in turn allows us to observe what is important to other people. Because of this two-way relationship we have with anger, this kind of social relationship that humans have with anger, if we are not in control of our anger and we are too angry, we may not effectively communicate what's important to us because people start to discount our anger. On the other hand, if we're never angry and never get worked up or upset about things, people may have a hard time understanding what's important to us. Next, let's talk about what it feels like to have anger. Anger has a few things called action urges. These are the things that we experience wanting to do when we're angry. With anger, this can look like a number of things, including violence, pushing, shoving, or hitting. We may also feel the need to clench our fists or become very close to the person we're confronting. Another common expression of anger is to stand in front of somebody that you perceive to be threatened. If somebody is too close to your child or your partner and is in some way feeling threatening, you may feel the need to insert yourself between the two people. This is a natural, normal anger response that just tells us, hey, we need to protect that person, and then we go into action. Next, let's look at what it looks like to be angry, or what it looks like when other people are angry. Often when we're angry, our blood starts to pump faster, our body temperature may increase, and so we may be more red than usual. We may also produce more spit than usual and have a harder time, especially if we're talking or shouting, keeping that spit inside our mouths. We may drool or spit when we're talking. Other things we might do when we're angry is raise our voice or lower our voice significantly. These are communication tools that get other people to pay more attention to us. We may also experience extra tension, especially in our arms, shoulders, legs, and back, that kind of make us, scrunch up when we're angry. This tension is just a, proactive way of our body getting ready to take action. We can also observe people clenching their jaw or having their nostrils flare. These are all natural responses to having increased adrenaline and cortisol going through the body. And so they're pretty easy tells if you're looking at somebody and trying to decide if they're angry. Let's look at what it looks like when we've had anger but are no longer angry. One of the things we tend to do when we've recently experienced anger is to have a lower threshold for anger, to feel like we have less patience or that we have a shorter fuse. This is because anger leaves our body with a lot of stress chemicals floating around in it, and it takes time to clean all of those up. And so it's very easy for our body to shift back into that state of arousal, that hyper energy and need to act, because those chemicals are already there in our blood and ready to go. After we've been angry, we may also have a harder time slowing down our breathing rate or heart rate. We may have a hard time relaxing in general or going to sleep and staying asleep. And the last thing that we tend to do when we're angry is blame other people for things that have happened, even if we, on some level, understand that that person may not actually be to blame. Our brains, when we are aroused in that way, are looking for solutions, and often there isn't a clear solution to a situation, and so our brain wants to pick a villain so that we can point our ire at that person. So when we store these emotions, we have something to attach it to in our memories. Unfortunately, the fact that our brain picks a person does not mean that that person actually deserves to bear the brunt of our anger or general upsetness, and they may not be in fact to blame for anything. They're just the target that your brain has picked. So be careful when you're angry to make sure that if you start to assign blame to anyone, that you give yourself space from that moment and say maybe that person isn't to blame, because your judgment may be impaired by your brain's desire to find an easy solution. Next, let's consider the interactions between emotions. When we talk about anger, it is a stress response, so it's very easy for us to move from anger to fear and vice versa. This is because our interpretation of the situation is what determines the emotion that we experience. So if we are angry and then we perceive a greater threat than we originally perceived, we may become afraid very quickly and just as strongly, because the chemicals are already in our body for that emotion to exist. On the other hand, because happiness and sadness are so directly caught up inside the brain, it can have this weird effect where we feel happy or sad and angry or afraid at the same time, because our brain is generating either the happiness or the sadness, and our kidneys are majorly responsible for producing the chemicals for the anger or fear. And so we can experience these mixes of emotion in ways that we don't normally experience a mix of happiness and sadness quite as strongly. So if you're having confusion about what emotion you're experiencing, recognize that having happiness or sadness along with anger is very common. With that said, if we want to turn our anger off, if we want to disarm our anger or pull it apart and make sure it doesn't pop back up the same way it has been, the key way to do this is introduce intimacy. And this can be a real intimacy, it can be a physical intimacy or an emotional intimacy, it can be fictional, it can be something that you just assume or presume inside your head when you're thinking about the situation. And I'll give you a concrete example of this. I used to experience terrible road rage because I was terrified to be on the road in a car. And when somebody would cut me off or drive too closely near my bumper or, some other dangerous behavior, I would become so angry I would want to throw things at these people. Now, I never broke the law and I never got hurt, but this would have eventually become a problem. And I dealt with it for several years before realizing that I could not sustain this. So when I decided to disarm my road rage, I had years of experience under my belt of reacting this way every time somebody was on the road. And I didn't really know how to disarm that kind of a strong reinforced memory of emotion. And so what I practiced doing is forgiveness and kindness. So when somebody cut me off, I would think they probably have a good cause. Maybe there's an emergency. I hope that they are doing well. And so I would think about it as if they were in pain or having a need that I could help with or that I could at least not impede. And that helped my brain go, oh, there's context there that means I shouldn't be angry. Let's just move on. And it didn't take me very long, just a couple of years, to really unhook all of the immediate responses I had from my road rage just by practicing this at home while not driving. Thinking about anyone who cut me off that day, thinking, okay, that person probably had an emergency. Maybe their wife was going into labor. Critically, I never looked in these cars after making these positive assumptions. I never thought about maybe they're driving in the wrong direction from the hospital. And if I did, I would think, well, maybe they were going home to get someone who was sick and then take them to the hospital. Things like that. By assuming the best, assuming kindness and a need for generosity and gentility, what I was doing was recontextualizing my emotional experience. And so the anger was no longer as strongly attached. In the same way, if we're very upset with somebody that we care about a lot, we can kind of fizzle out our anger and not have that emotion anymore just by spending time with them. This is really good for long-term relationships in some cases, but can be very detrimental to relationships if there's a persistent problem that you're having trouble confronting because you love the person so much. It's important to find this balance, and to be able to move on is great, but we also have to be able to solve problems if they do exist. So let's talk about when we have too much and too little anger. Too much anger looks like rage. It's an uncontrolled fury that we don't have the ability to direct at the correct source, act in effective ways while it's present, or it otherwise is disruptive to our lives. It can be very hard to break this cycle because it does include producing a lot of these stress hormones that make us more likely to be upset in the future. This is one reason that stress management classes are a thing, because it takes time to practice skills to reduce anger. Another thing that can happen if we're angry too often is that somebody else can use our anger to their ends. Our focus tends to be much narrower when we're angry. And so if somebody can tap into our anger or feed us anger and then give us things to believe while we're angry, we may be more likely to believe them because we're looking for solutions. In this way, we can be misled by people in our community, family members, politicians, any number of ways that we interact with other people who may make us angry, and then are influenced by their opinions and statements while we're angry. Now, those are what happens when we have too much anger. And you might think that it would be good to never have anger because too much anger can be so damaging. But it's important to have anger. Anger is an important part of how our brain communicates to us that we understand something is important, and it's an important part of how we communicate to other people that something is important to us. If we fundamentally lack the ability to get angry, we become less effective in communicating with others and in understanding our own morals and values. Finally, if we don't have enough anger, we will ignore things that definitely need solutions. And this can be really common in trauma-informed environments. Children who go through child abuse unlearn their anger because there's no effective way to use anger in those unhealthy situations. And so as they get older, they have no good outlets for anger, and either they start to experience anger that they can't control, or they are so afraid of becoming angry that they have difficulty advocating for themselves, asserting their needs, or even talking to their providers about their genuine problems because they are not engaged with their anger and don't understand what their needs are as well. Thanks for joining me for this chapter of our emotional literacy segments. This is our third emotion of 5. Over the next 2 weeks, we'll have fear and disgust. After these 5 videos are live, we will have a series of videos talking about how to change our relationship with each emotion, specific skills and strategies you can use to increase or decrease each category of emotion, and how to have a healthier relationship with it. These skills have changed my life over the last 10 years, and I've seen them change other people's lives as well, so I really hope you'll join me in learning those skills for yourself. Hey, thanks for checking out my video on anger. If you want more information, check the link in the description below. Thanks again for stopping by, and remember to be kind to yourself and others.